The 1950s were supposed to be Britain's great automotive comeback. The war was over, the factories were running again, and millions of families were finally ready to buy their first car. Manufacturers made bold promises. Showrooms gleamed with optimism. But behind the polished bonnets and the glossy brochures, something had gone very wrong. Some of these cars rusted before their owners finished paying for them. Others broke down on roads they were specifically built to handle. And one car on this list still frustrates the few owners brave enough to run one today. Let us count them down. Number 10, Standard 8. When Standard launched the 8 in 1953, they marketed it as the sensible family car for a nation rebuilding itself. It was affordable, it was simple, and it promised reliable everyday transport for working British families who deserved something better than a bicycle. But the reality was far less inspiring. The Standard 8 used a modest 803cc four-cylinder engine producing just 26 horsepower, which left drivers struggling on any road with the slightest incline. Overtaking was not merely difficult, it was genuinely dangerous. The car felt underpowered even by the modest standards of the era. But that was only the beginning. The interior was stripped to the point of insult, with no exterior door handles on early models and a heater that cost extra. Owners who had saved carefully to afford this car felt genuinely cheated when they discovered how little their money had actually bought. Something much worse is still ahead on this list. Number 9, Jowett Javelin. When the Jowett Javelin arrived in the late 1940s, it genuinely felt like Britain's answer to the European avant-garde. Here was a flat-four engine mounted ahead of the front axle, a streamlined aerodynamic body, and a level of engineering ambition that most British manufacturers simply were not attempting. Buyers who wanted something different, something clever, were immediately drawn to it. And then things started going wrong. The 1486cc horizontally opposed four-cylinder engine produced around 50 horsepower, which was reasonable, but the unit developed a catastrophic reputation for crankshaft failures that no amount of running repairs could solve. The gearbox was equally troublesome, failing with a frequency that left owners stranded and furious. Jowett issued modifications. Owners came back. Jowett issued more modifications. Dealers grew exhausted managing the complaints. By 1954 the company had collapsed entirely, leaving owners of a genuinely original car with no support, no spare parts, and no recourse. Very few cars have punished loyal buyers quite so completely. Number 8, Austin A30. Austin positioned the A30 as the modern small car Britain had been waiting for since 1951. It looked fresh, it felt contemporary, and it promised economy motoring without humiliation. Early buyers were genuinely excited. Then they drove one in the rain. The A30's 803cc A-series engine delivered around 28 horsepower, and while the little unit was technically sound, the car around it was not. Water entered the cabin through poorly sealed doors and windscreens with infuriating regularity, leaving drivers damp and deeply unimpressed. But that was not even the most damaging problem. The bodywork proved extremely vulnerable to rust, particularly around the sills and rear arches, which began rotting on cars that were barely a few years old. For families who had stretched their budget to buy new, watching their investment dissolve into orange flakes was nothing short of heartbreaking. Very few people talk about just how bad it got. The story ahead only becomes stranger. Number 7, Daimler Conquest Century. Here is where the frustration becomes almost darkly comic. The Daimler Conquest Century was sold as a sporting prestige saloon in 1954, offering 100 horsepower from a twin-carburetor 2.4-liter six-cylinder engine. That figure was genuinely impressive for the period, and buyers who paid the considerable premium expected a car that matched its promises. What they received was a vehicle with a preselector fluid flywheel gearbox that confused, baffled, and infuriated drivers in equal measure. It required an entirely different technique compared to any conventional gearbox on the market. Owners had to select the next gear before actually needing it, which demanded constant forward thinking at a time when most drivers simply wanted to drive. The steering was also surprisingly vague for a car of this price and pretension. Buyers who had chosen a Daimler over a Jaguar often found themselves quietly regretting the decision within months. Most people have genuinely forgotten just how controversial this car was. The next entry is even more revealing. Number 6. Morris Oxford Series 2. The Morris Oxford Series 2 arrived in 1954 wearing a respectable name and carrying genuine public goodwill. Morris had earned its reputation over decades, and buyers trusted what the badge represented. But the Series 2 damaged that trust in a way the brand took years to fully repair. The 1489cc B-Series engine produced around 50 horsepower, which was perfectly adequate, and yet the car somehow still felt sluggish and unresponsive in a way that mechanics struggled to explain satisfactorily. But the mechanical mediocrity was not what truly angered owners. It was the rust. It was always the rust. The Oxford Series 2 corroded at a rate that seemed almost aggressive, with structural sections compromised on cars that had barely reached their third birthday. Repair costs mounted rapidly, and for families who had purchased on hire purchase, the financial pressure became genuinely distressing. Would you have taken the risk knowing what was coming? There is still much worse ahead on this list. Number 5. Sunbeam Talbot 90 Mark II-A. The Sunbeam Talbot 90 carried rail motorsport credibility into the early 1950s, having competed with genuine distinction in Alpine trials. So when the Mark II-A reached showrooms, buyers with sporting ambitions were genuinely drawn to it. The 2,267cc four-cylinder engine produced around 77 horsepower, and the car handled with more confidence than most British saloons of the era. But something was deeply wrong beneath that attractive exterior. The engine developed a reputation for overheating under sustained hard use. Precisely the kind of use that buyers had been led to believe the car was built for. Owners who pushed their Sunbeam as the brochure encouraged them to found themselves stranded with alarming regularity. The cooling system simply could not cope with ambition. And what made it worse was that Roots Group had effectively known about the problem and chosen optimism over engineering solutions. The sense of betrayal among enthusiast buyers was sharp and lasting. The frustration coming up next cut even deeper. Number 4. Riley Pathfinder. Riley had always stood for something refined and individual, which made the Pathfinder's reception in 1953 so particularly painful. On the surface, this was a handsome car with a twin-cam 2.5-litre four-cylinder engine producing 110 horsepower, numbers that placed it firmly in sporting saloon territory. But underneath the elegance lurked a suspension problem that genuinely frightened experienced drivers. The rear axle was located by a panhard rod, and on early examples that rod could shear from its mounting bracket during hard cornering with almost no warning. Police forces who used the Pathfinder in service found this out the hard way. The British motoring press wasted no time finding a nickname for it. They called it the Ditch Finder. It was not a term of affection. BMC rushed the car to the 1953 Motor Show before the engineering was truly resolved, and ordinary buyers paid the price for that decision. Number 3 is a genuine shock, and one that most people have completely forgotten. Number 3. Standard Vanguard Phase 2. The original Standard Vanguard had been bold and transatlantic in its ambitions when it launched in 1948, and for a while buyers responded enthusiastically. By the time the Phase 2 arrived in 1952, however, cracks were appearing that polished chrome could not hide. The 2088cc four-cylinder engine produced around 68 horsepower and was connected to a 3-speed gearbox that felt increasingly outdated as competitors began offering 4-speed units. But the headline problem was reliability. The Phase 2 developed a persistent reputation for head gasket failures that left owners stranded and facing repair bills that were painful relative to the car's purchase price. Standard's dealers were frequently overwhelmed with warranty complaints that the company struggled to manage with either speed or grace. Owners felt abandoned at precisely the moment they needed support most. For a car that had promised to take on the world export market, the domestic embarrassment was considerable. What is coming next managed something even more damaging to its owners. You genuinely will not believe it. Number 2. Bond Minicar Mark C. Here is where the list takes a turn that even seasoned British motoring historians find astonishing. The Bond Minicar was sold as ultra-economy transport for the budget-conscious buyer who simply needed to get from one place to another without spending a fortune. The Mark C used a tiny 197cc VS 2-stroke single-cylinder engine producing around 8 horsepower, which, on the flat and with considerable patience, could reach approximately 45 miles per hour. But the car had no conventional reverse gear whatsoever. To move backwards, drivers had to stop the engine completely and restart it in reverse using the Dynastart unit, a procedure that was slow, unreliable, and deeply embarrassing in any public place. In a busy car park or on a narrow country lane with a tractor approaching, this was not merely inconvenient, it was genuinely humiliating. Owners who had hoped economy motoring meant dignity discovered it meant something quite different. Could you imagine explaining this to your passengers on a rainy February afternoon? Number 1 is the car that still generates real anger today. Number 1, Singer SM1500. The Singer SM1500 arrived in showrooms carrying extraordinary promise. Here was a car with an overhead camshaft engine, a genuine technical rarity among British volume saloons of the early 1950s. Singer marketed it with genuine pride, describing it as offering dignity, style, and perfect balance. Buyers who aspired to something more sophisticated than the average family saloon paid a premium and waited on long waiting lists to get one. What greeted them was deeply frustrating. The steering column gear change was so heavy and uncooperative that contemporary reports noted drivers were literally ramming their knuckles against the dashboard in sheer exasperation trying to make a smooth change. The controls throughout were described as exhaustingly heavy, particularly for women drivers whom Singer had specifically targeted in its advertising. Meanwhile, the styling, which had looked transatlantic and modern in 1949, dated visibly and rapidly as competitors arrived with full-width modern bodywork. Buyers who had paid a premium felt the betrayal acutely, and many of them never returned to the Singer badge again. British cars of the 1950s carried the hopes of an entire recovering nation, and most of them tried their best against genuinely difficult odds. But trying your best does not excuse rust that arrived before the first service, handling that frightened the driver, or a gearbox so brutal it left drivers nursing bruised knuckles. These 10 vehicles represent the gap between what was promised and what was delivered, a gap that cost ordinary families real money and real heartbreak. If any of these brought back memories, let us know in the comments. And if you think we missed one, tell us which car deserves a place on this list.